Good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Christine Madden, President of the International Youth Nuclear Congress, and I'm excited to welcome you to the second rendition of Climate Talks. Climate Talks is an initiative between NICE Future and the International Youth Nuclear Congress focused on expanding the nuclear community's understanding of climate solutions beyond the traditional scope of nuclear science and technology, as well as offering opportunities to explore cross-cutting niche topics within our sector, like consent-based siting and nuclear economics. By engaging with experts from diverse fields, we're hopeful that you'll gain valuable insights that can lead you into interdisciplinary collaboration and enhance our ability to communicate effectively across the climate community. So for those of you who don't know who IYNC is, we're a global network of young professionals. We have a network of over 100,000 young people across 48 countries, including the United Nations and Vienna. And we're focused on professional development and growth of young generation networks, young professionals, and students. So we're focused on communicating the peaceful uses of nuclear power and its applications, including as part of a clean energy transition, through establishing mechanisms to integrate young voices into decision-making processes, and creating pathways for global and intergenerational networking and knowledge exchange. So our activities focus on 4 pillars. The first pillar is knowledge transfer and networking. The second pillar is climate action. The third is professional development. And the fourth pillar is YGN support. So I'd encourage you to visit our website and follow us on LinkedIn to learn a bit more. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Yaldase, who's going to tell you a little bit about the Clean Energy Ministerial's NICE Future Initiative.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome everyone to this talk. My name is Jal Desai. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who is the operating agent for NICE Future. So NICE Future, which stands for Nuclear Innovation for Clean Energy Future, is one of the work streams of the Clean Energy Ministerial. And this initiative envisions a world in which nuclear energy innovations and advances the clean energy goals. And the NICE Future Initiative recognizes that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to energy and fosters collaborations among clean energy supporters in exploring diverse solutions. This initiative is co-led by US, Canada, and Japan, and NREL is the operating agent. And we do a lot of activities such as technical assistance, workshops, webinars, talks like the one you're listening today. We do a lot of reports and fact sheets, and then partnerships as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the NICE Future Initiative, we have got 5 working groups. So first one is focusing on messaging and communication. The second one is on advanced reactor technologies and innovative nuclear renewable integration. The third one is on economic modeling, financing, and regulatory aspect. And the fourth one is on non-electric application. And the fifth one is on technical development, mentorship, and workforce development. And I would encourage you all to check out the website and follow us on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Back to you, Christine.
Thank you, Yal. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to introduce Paul Murphy today. Paul Murphy is the founder and managing director of Murphy Energy and Infrastructure Consulting. He's also the managing director of Green Sable Consulting and the managing director of nuclear and co-head of the public finance and government relations at Cross River Infrastructure Partners in KPMG. So Paul specializes in energy financing and project management. He's an expert in nuclear power development and financing, advising international bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, OECD, as well as the United States government. Paul has extensive experience in nuclear policy, nuclear frameworks, and risk management, and he also teaches nuclear financing and contracting at institutions like the IAEA and Texas A&M. He additionally has advised several countries on developing nuclear programs, including Turkey, Ghana, and Uzbekistan. And last but not least, Paul has also been the IYNC lawyer for the last decade. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks a lot, Christine. Let me share my screen and we can get started. Are you seeing it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Let me just get the display going. And here we go. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the economics of nuclear energy, but what you're going to find is that that topic brings in a lot of related topics. And, first of all, a thank you to the Nice Future and IYNC for asking me to give these remarks. We're going to talk about 30 minutes and then leave time for questions. So please put together your questions as we go along. So just to get started, when we talk about nuclear projects, it's impossible to talk about financing without talking about other things like project structuring, project delivery, risk, and of course, economics. And when we think about creating a financeable project, it really gets into the project fundamentals, and that's where the economic side comes in. Unfortunately, we tend to have unrealistic expectations in nuclear. These are complicated projects. To be fair, when you get into the mega project space, and when you study mega projects, you will find that lots of mega projects, not just nuclear, run over budget and over schedule. But when we think about nuclear, there's been this tendency to think of nuclear business like any other business. But I would argue that when we look at the fundamental role that electricity plays in society today, you really need to think about nuclear energy as critical infrastructure. And when you do that, it starts opening up new ways to think about projects. We have to realize that identification and management of risk is very important, and then recognize that they change over time. What the risks are during development versus construction versus operation. They're very different. And that affects what money is available, how expensive it is, and recognizing that there are different types of money available at different points in time. And so you see me already as we talk about projects, I tend to start drifting into the financing space. But really, it's that distinguishing different pools of capital, because the only way you're going to attract capital into these projects is if you have a sound economic model. You have to repay the debt, equity has to get a certain rate of return, or else you're not going to finance the project. And of course, as we think about projects and development and sources of financing and all these things, there's a recognition that unfortunately in our world today, geopolitics matter, and those have to be factored into these discussions as well. But just finishing on this slide and these initial observations, when we think about risk, there's always that question, hey, if things go wrong, who's going to take that risk and where's the money going to be to pay for that? So it's something we have to recognize. And then bringing it back to economics, the US has the largest nuclear fleet in the world. We have 94 operating reactors. That means we built well over 100. There's good lessons to be learned. And one of them is every single reactor that's ever been built in the United States, when it was built in a regulated market. We do not build projects in merchant markets. And so there's a reason for that. And you're going to hear more about that as we go forward. But investors and lenders want a stable rate of return. They don't want a bear market risk. They want to see a regulated market, a long-term offtake. These are the things that are important from an economic side to drive overall project viability, which then translates in the ability to finance the project. So one of the things that we have a challenge and kind of an opportunity in the nuclear space. And when we look at how we develop projects, there's this long list of things in the nuclear space that are beneficial. But when you do a project financial model, none of this stuff goes into the model. I'm not going to go through each of these, but energy security has been a big theme ever since February of 2022. That was always in my presentations, but no one really talked about it. But there's not a number that you put in a financial model for energy security. Similarly, these reactors, the Gen 2 reactors were licensed for 40 years with proper maintenance and refurbishment. They're going to run for 60 or 80 years, which means that the new designs, the Gen 3 and Gen 3 Plus that are licensed for 60 years, probably will run for 100. But when you do a financial model, everything discounts to zero after about 30 years, probably before, depending on the discount rate you use. So you have an asset that is a 100-year operating asset that in a financial model tells you all those out years don't matter. Yet intellectually, we're like, well, it kind of does. And that's where you get into this concept of critical infrastructure. Because if you build 1,000 megawatt reactor that runs all the time, generates clean energy, these are good things from a national planning perspective. And so how do we value these, what are important factors, some economic, some policy, some environmental? How do we capture these values? Because our financial models don't. And I would encourage you to think of the case of France versus Italy. And I'm half Italian, so I can criticize my own people. But when you look at what happened in 1986, when Chernobyl happened, Italy were an emotional people. They shut down all their reactors. France kept going. From that point forward, Italy paid the highest prices for electricity in Western and Southern Europe. France was paying the cheapest prices. Italy was importing electricity. Italy was importing fuel to run their thermal plants. And so you sit there and you say, well, what does that mean? Why do I care? Well, that meant that households were having to pay more for electricity. That hurts disposable income. It meant that industry was paying more for electricity. That hurts industrial production in the economy. But at the project level, again, nothing goes into a financial model in deciding as a developer, should I build this project? But you can see that in a national planning level, from a policy level, who can capture these benefits? Who can consider these benefits? Who gets the tax revenue from the project? Who benefits by job creation? The project does not benefit. However, the country benefits, the surrounding region benefits. And so when we think about economics and how to structure projects, there's this tendency to just say, well, I'm going to sell the price at this price point for this long, and that's it. And if there's nothing else you take away from this presentation, it should be this slide, because there's a lot of work that's been done by different groups and for different jurisdictions on what these intangible economics are, what the impact analysis is. And I did an extensive project this summer where we looked at various studies. We considered about 20 different studies, and they were all different depending on technology or jurisdiction. Some were focused on the technology, some were focused on the project, but there were some universal themes. And so for your project, you could spend 6 months to a year doing the same work. And I can pretty much tell you what it's going to say before you do it, because when you look across all these things done by different people for different purposes, you get these prevailing themes. And so, try to capture a few on the next two slides, but obviously the economic and employment benefits, the green energy benefits, achieving climate goals, the strategic aspects of nuclear in terms of energy security and industrial development, technological leadership. Then you get into the localized economic impacts of jobs and human resources development and the secondary economy that forms around these plants. So when other industries have to support it, and the supply chain benefits. And, number 5 is really important. To really assess the benefit of nuclear, you have to do a lot of modeling, and none of it's precise. It's all a little bit speculative, but the more you do and the more robust you do, and then you benchmark it against other studies, that helps to have this reinforcing effect to show what these benefits are. And then, of course, you integrate this into your policies, because what we find is that in order for these projects to succeed, the role of government is very important. Depending on where you are, it can take a lot of different roles. It's not going to be all things to all people, because styles of government matter, capacities of government, both human resources and financial matter, but there's a lot of different ways that government needs to be integrated into the process. Governments can help de-risk projects. They can delay projects with changes in policy or regulatory changes or lack of support. And so often when we're structuring, figuring out where government comes into the project is very important. In what manner and for how long? If you build a robust project and you ask for government support, maybe you can refinance them out later with other money so that you're trying to take their money, which is cheaper during a high risk period, and then you bring in other capital later once the project's in operation. But how to bring in government is very important for the structuring of the project, for some of the economic policies and incentives and funding sources that support this project. And the reason I spent time on those intangible benefits is because if you're a project developer and you go into the government and say, hey, I need some support. Say, well, why should I help you? You say, well, I need 2 units of value, but it's going to unlock 10 units of value. Well, that's simple math. That's net 8. You do that deal every time. But if you don't articulate, going back a few slides to what those benefits are and do it again, point number 5 on this slide, you need to quantify it. It will be challenged. It is a little speculative, but you need to quantify when I say I'm going to give you all these benefits if you help me, and those benefits do not go in my pocket. This is all part of the economic and policy case around how we make these projects go. So what are we trying to do in the economic sense? We're trying to create certainty. These projects take a long time to develop. They cost a lot of money. There's the whole programmatic support around the project. When we think about developing the regulatory system, the legal system, the people that go into that, all the things that have to happen, it is a big endeavor. And again, that's why we talk about the role of government so much, because private industry simply can't do it alone because of, if nothing else, the regulatory aspects. So what we're trying to do is say, hey, if we're going to do all this and we're going to create an asset that runs all the time and should run all the time, well, then I need to monetize that. I need to know that if this thing works, that I can sell the electricity at a point for this much time. Otherwise, why would I do it? There's no divine right to financing. This is not some privilege. You have to create a viable project. And again, this is not unique to the nuclear sector. We have infrastructure needs all over the world. And one of the reasons private capital does not go into the infrastructure is because the economics aren't favorable. And we could debate that and we could talk about different types of projects. But the main message is, how do we create certainty? And you look at the US just as an example, all these plants built in regulated markets. Then we deregulated some of the markets. We gave subsidies to renewables. We gave dispatch preferences to renewables. And then we say, why aren't these nuclear plants making money anymore? Why aren't we building more nuclear? Well, it's fairly obvious, right? Because we've lost that certainty that we created. And so you can either do a regulated structure. We have regulated markets in the US, the UK, has a regulated asset-based model they're going to try. You can do power purchase agreements. There's contract for differences. But what you're trying to do is create that certainty. And it comes back to this idea from a government perspective. Why should I? If the market won't support this, why should I do it? And it's that point again about those intangible benefits, some of which are really important, things like energy security, decarbonization, et cetera. But it's that idea of critical infrastructure, and that's where when we think about designing projects, we worry about cost and schedule. But I would also argue to you, maybe beyond the scope of this presentation, but I would say, if given a choice between being on time or on budget, I would choose on time every time, because these are assets that are difficult, challenging, achievable. But once I have it in operation, it's going to run all the time, run for a very long time. And that's how I make my money. So that's how I want to get into the business. But I need that market certainty that once I get there, that the economics work. So we think about project structuring, and we think about project delivery. So, from a planning perspective, you want to do that lessons learned analysis, both what has gone poorly in other projects, but also what's gone well. You want to have a robust project risk register by phase, and you want to have a project development plan. You want to show that all these things can happen. And you got to remember that the money has to support the schedule. The regulatory approach has to support the schedule. The human resources, the people, both professional and craft labor, they all have to be there to support this. And so, again, the government support to help make this happen. But then, going back to those project fundamentals, having a strong project sponsor, having money behind the deal, using fiscal tools, tax policy, those types of things to help things. And then to really be able to deliver the project. I think that there's oftentimes we see vendors who are promoting technologies set project dates that are completely unrealistic. And, if you can't survive 3 to 5 questions, you shouldn't be out there saying things. And we've seen that mistake being made a lot. But again, is it a viable project? Do we have the economics, that revenue certainty over a long period of time? Because, in other sectors, a 20-year power purchase agreement was fine in the gas sector. But this is an asset that's going to run for maybe 100 years. So if you don't have certainty beyond 20 years, then as an investor, I have to recover all of my investment in a shorter period of time. You just made the money more expensive. So that revenue return period becomes very important to the cost of the money that you're trying to get. And again, that being realistic in the business plan becomes very important. When you do that initial scoping of a project, this is kind of a list. It's not meant to be exclusive, but you can see a lot of things are in here and some things are not in here because, again, during the initial scoping, but you want to see, okay, market, what's my demand for the electricity? What's the price? How am I going to drive the structure around the sale of electricity to support a financeable project? And then, if this is part of decarbonization goals, well, how do I value that in the market? In the United States, we have 300 years of coal. Why don't we just build coal plants? Well, because that's bad for the environment. Okay. Well, we have lots of cheap natural gas too. Well, that's a little better than coal, but not so much. So how do we, if the market left to its own forces doesn't value the decarbonization benefit, then you're not going to get the energy mix you want. So now you have to put economic incentives in place, either punitive or rewarding, the carrot or the stick, maybe both, to make sure certain things are built and not others. And that's part of it too, because money only goes to sound projects which are driven by economics. Now, if you're a government that just has lots of money and says, well, we need to do this, maybe you just finance it and you don't care if you have that money. Most governments aren't in that position. And a lot of market economies are not set up where you have just this huge national utility that has a massive balance sheet that can do that. So again, you see, even in this initial scoping where we're already thinking about the sale of electricity before maybe we even decided to go forward with the project. So now a little more on economics and of course the financing. And really what we're looking at, and this is kind of from a financing perspective, what does a lender say? What does an investor say? How am I going to get paid back? Will I get paid back? What's the way that this project makes commercial sense for a lender or an investor? So you've got to look at the electricity market, right? We got to understand that the market left to itself does not value all the things we started this presentation with. So what does that mean? If there's a lot of good work that I would recommend to you that the Nuclear Energy Agency has done on total system cost analysis, because generally people look at levelized cost of electricity, but really you have to factor in the total costs of the project that include the grid. So if you're a wind developer and you just sign a power purchase agreement that has to pay you whenever you generate, well, that's great. That's wonderful. But it's not paying for all the grid upgrades. It's not paying for transmission. It's not paying for when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. That gets into the total system cost analysis, which is an economic analysis of not just the project, but of the whole electrical system. So again, scaling your analysis at the right level to encompass all the issues becomes very important. And, at least in the United States, nuclear plants don't set the price. They follow the market. So this is why when you deregulate, nuclear projects might have trouble. So this idea of looking at your electricity market, regulated, deregulated, mixed, does it make a project viable or not? What else is happening in the market that you say, oh, we deregulated, but we really haven't fully because we prefer things other than other things? Have we priced carbon? Have we valued decarbonization? And it's not enough to say we want to decarbonize. It's not enough to say we want clean energy. That's nice, but as a project developer, what matters are the economics. So unless you somehow create an economics incentive for clean energy or a disincentive for everything else, you're not going to get the results you want. So the electricity market structure becomes critical to the story because, again, if you don't have a sound economic case, why would anybody lend to your project? Why would anybody invest in your project? What is the price of the money if the project is not based on sound economic principles? So when we look at all of this, there's precedent out there for what entities are trying to do, countries are trying to do. And these are just some examples. But we see, again, a host of different things that range from grants and cost sharing agreements that help technology get to market. We see the possibility of governments investing in projects. We see in regulated markets that some are allowing cost recovery during construction, which is a concept in the United States that now the UK is using as a regulated asset-based model. It's the same principle. You're allowing recovery earlier on. The UK has also used the contract for difference model, which is a glorified PPA. We can price emissions credits. We can price capacity so that you say, well, this is an asset that runs all the time. But if you're not selling all the time, then you're probably going to shut down. So in the US, again, as an example, when we deregulated markets, some nuclear plants were out of the money. So they were going to be shut down and some were. But then we said, oh, we better save them because when we shut off that nuclear plant, all our emissions go up. The economy goes in the tank for that location because all those jobs went away. Maybe that's not such a good thing. So how do we value that? That's where you see capacity payments and other things. See tax policy. We see from a financing perspective, export credit agencies that are, content based. But we're also seeing green bonds now in the nuclear sector where nuclear projects are being certified for under, ESG rating groups, and they're qualifying. Now, the first wave was not for new build, it was for other things. But now we're even seeing it for new build, and we're seeing, again, precedent in a number of countries, albeit with entities with large balance sheets. That's also part of the story. But, again, other things happening because we're valuing the ESG benefit, the sustainability benefit of nuclear. But the message is we can talk about why nuclear plants are good for all these things, but we have to somehow create an economic value to this stuff. Otherwise, the projects are not going to happen at the scale we need. So again, the economics drive the financing drives overall project viability, but you get nowhere unless the project is built on strong fundamentals, whether it's the technology or who's going to build the thing. All the story has to hold together at all levels. And so, again, a little bit on financing, but you see that left column, you need a solid economic rationale for the project. Where's the electricity going, at what price, for how long? What's the rate of return I'm getting on that? Can I do this on my balance sheet? Maybe. Can I get government support, sovereign backing? Maybe. But We need a cost model. We need a delivery model. You want people that have done this before. So it's got to be believable. And then you just say, okay, where's the money coming from? What happens if things go wrong? And if the project is not in the money in the first instance, that isn't the end of the story, because that's where policy can come in and say that, hey, if I need this project to grow my economy, to decarbonize, well, those are values that now I can assign to the project and build, I can augment the project economics. So that something that may not be financeable because it's not economic becomes financeable. And as we start bringing new technologies in, this is a bigger issue, because when you're in first of a kind space, that becomes an even bigger problem in terms of getting to market. So we have to think about where the money comes from, but that's both, remember, the project, but also the program, the nuclear program that you put around the project. So for example, when I was involved with representing the export credit agencies on the Baraka project in the UAE, we looked at the project when we diligenced it, but we looked at what the country was doing as well. And you need both what's happening at the country level, at the program level, to align with what's happening at the project level so that the whole story holds together. So just some concluding thoughts before we move to question and answer. I think there's a bunch of key themes in this discussion. There's a risk reduction aspect where we're always looking to de-risk the project. We're always looking to bring in lessons learned, both positive and negative, from other projects. We want to create certainty. That's certainty in all levels. The theme here today has been economic certainty, but that's all certainty on deliverability. We've got to have certain financial strength behind the deal. We've got to have a project that makes sense. We want to see that government support. We want to see market signals, and really a public-private relationship at some level. And again, it can vary by project within a country. It can value across, it can change and vary across countries. But you see that the policy side comes into this discussion so much, and there's their cooperation between the private sector and government to do it. And at the end of the day, this is all about putting together a sound project. It's that structuring, it's that early thinking, but that early thinking needs to consider financing. It needs to consider economics. It's not just enough to say, we like nuclear, we picked a technology. That's part of it, but it's a holistic approach to project development that includes the economics, which then in turn brings in the financing, which you'll hear people say financing is the hardest thing, or financing is where the project really is put to the greatest test. And that's true, but there's so many other things that go into that. And you can see, hopefully, in this presentation, how all of these issues are interconnected. None of them can be looked at in isolation. So just a short, cheat sheet for summarizing with a few issues and then some further explanation, whether it comes to the credit behind the deal, the revenue stream, government support, sort of the reputational risk analysis. Beyond the scope of the presentation, may be a good idea for another presentation, but really when lenders and investors look at projects, there is that question, how do I get paid back? When do I get paid back? But they also want to know, is this a good project? And I put that in quotes because it's subjective. But when we looked, going back to the UAE example, it was a government credit. The government of Abu Dhabi was AAA rated. From a financing perspective, the financial documentation was rather straightforward. But we spent a ton of time diligencing the project, from the regulator to the country to things happening at the project level. And the UAE was, INEC was committed to working with the lender group to go through all these issues, but it took a lot of time. And that was part of that reputational risk analysis, because, lenders, investors want to know it's a good project, and again, are you living in fantasy land? You don't want to be the UK head of EDF when he said in the 2000s, you'll be cooking your Christmas turkeys with electricity from Hinkley Point C in 2017. Well, now they're hoping that Hinkley Point makes 2030. you don't want to be that guy. So, be careful in what you put out there. You don't want it to be, we need pixie dust and unicorns and the hands of God coming down on the project to make it work. It needs to be based on a reasonable level of expertise, but also conservatism. And then another topic for another day, adequate nuclear liability coverage, but I just mentioned it here. So with that, I thank you all for your attention. I hope it was helpful. Contact information is here for future reference, but I will stop sharing my screen, and Christine, back to you for questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. So I will open the floor for questions, but also maybe I'll lead off with the first question. So last week we learned a bit about climate or about carbon financing or pricing and how that plays and how essentially that can actually make nuclear really competitive across the different types of clean energies that we have, and also in response to coal and natural gas. And you gave some practical examples. Could you maybe dive a little bit deeper into potentially how carbon pricing could play a role? And also, I was thinking about the US, I think it was last year or the year before, put out this big report on the coal to nuclear transition, where you could essentially use all the supporting infrastructure and save up to $1 billion in total costs if you were to repurpose a coal plant to a nuclear power plant. Are those considerations also taken into effect in these models, or how could we ensure that countries are also thinking about that?
Good questions. Let's start with the coal to nuclear. I think, unfortunately, when a lot of these coal plants were built, the regulatory and environmental consciousness might not have been there, and they've been sitting there and running for a long time. So one of the concerns would be, when I start digging, what am I going to find? And how much site remediation do I need to do? So I think one of the things is it may not be tear down the existing infrastructure and build over the top of it. It might be build nearby for some of the reasons you said, if there's transmission. So this gets into very site specific stuff about whenever you're going onto a brownfield site, what does that really look like? What am I going to find? There's a risk in that. So, are you going to repurpose all of the coal plant? No. You're going to look at how long the stuff's been there. If you are going to use some of the physical stuff, for how much longer. I think the better way to think of it is, we need to get this coal offline. We need to replace it with nuclear. Why? Because those coal plants were baseload, and oh, by the way, yeah, industrial economies need to run on baseload generation. They can't run on intermittent generation. I mean, we know this now. And so, this is, I think, part of it. And looking at what are favorable sites or jurisdictions, thinking about these coal sites, how much land is available, local population support. Those are a lot of the factors that could be helpful. However, then you go back to the very simple thing of, okay, fine, I'm going to put it there and I'm going to generate power. How am I going to sell it? At what price? For how long? You still need the economic drivers, which in a deregulated market, unless you put other incentives in place, what gets into the first part of your question, we somehow need to value decarbonization, because unless we do that, you're not going to build, like in the United States, we're just going to build natural gas. We have cheap gas. It's easy to build. Anybody can build a gas plant. So why would you go through all the aggravation of building nuclear? So that's where you have to say, I need to value this some way, somehow. That could be with an emissions credit. It could be with a capacity payment. It could be with tax policy for investment tax credit or production tax credit. But somehow you need to create value in the sustainability benefit. I mean, yeah, you could just pass a law and say, thou shalt not build coal, and that's another solution, but somehow you have to bring money into the sector. And part of the reality is, okay, the announcement at COP28 last year, we're going to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. Well, that's not going to happen. But it's great that they're saying that that's the goal, because that helps drive behavior. And we want to try and do that as best we can. But you're not going to do that just on government budgets. You have to mobilize private capital. And private capital goes to, it's like water, it goes to the path of least resistance, right? Nuclear isn't the path of least resistance. So that's problem one. And then problem two is, well, what are the economics? And that's where, I spent a lot of time early to say all those intangible benefits are the reasons why the governments put in place the policies that get you the clean energy generation platform that you then want. And just, sorry, one more thing. The market does value that, because when I mentioned the green bonds, when OPG and Bruce Power, so OPG, Ontario Power Generation, they were the ones that did the first two green bond issuances. Both were oversubscribed by a factor of 6x, which means that the market is looking for good places to go with ESG focused money. So there is a value proposition there, but you got to do the work to create it. And people say, oh, well, I can issue a green bond too. Answer, no. If you're OPG or Bruce Power and you have a huge balance sheet, well, then yes, you can. But there's detail, but the most powerful message is oversubscribed by 6x.
Wow, that is powerful. So we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start with the first one from Dennis Johnnon. So it's said that it seems you're advocating for public support in nuclear power projects. Is there still a word or role for nuclear energy projects to be developed fully privately owned? For example, as data centers seem to look at nuclear energy to power their needs, could it be done without public support?
Maybe. The answer is maybe. And the reason why the answer is maybe is because the question always is, where is the money coming to develop the project? So you think about various points in time. So when you hit the button and it generates electricity, that's commercial operation. You go back from there and you have financial close, where you're closing on your debt and your equity. And sometimes people use the term FID, final investment decision, and that frankly could be at any point in time. But essentially, you have 9 figures to the left of the decimal point that somebody has to spend before you get to financial close. Where's that money coming from? And the problem is that equity investors do not want to put money in a project. Let's use large reactors for now. And somebody's going to say, well, what about small reactors? I'll get to that in a second. But large reactors for now, best case, 5 to 7 years of construction from issuance of a construction license, which is probably when you're going to close on your main financing too. So equity investors don't want to sit around for 10 years or 7 years putting money into a project and getting no revenue back. So when you talk to them, they'll say, when it's in operation, I'll invest, I'll refinance you out if you have a solid revenue stream. You say, okay, great. Well, what about before that? Now we're getting into the maybe. But the problem with developing projects is, where's that 9 figures left of the decimal point in US dollars, by the way, to drive the project forward? That's the problem. And so what you're finding is the private sector doesn't want to put that money in. Now, somebody might say, well, what about SMRs? Well, when you really get to what the SMR people are quoting now for their first projects, it's not that much different than a large reactor, because you're still in first of a kind space. And we hope they get better, and I'm sure they will. But the data center folks, what you've heard them say publicly is, I'll buy the power. Great, wonderful. Where's the money coming from to actually build the project? And so this is where you start getting into Maybe I can go find some people to put money in if they want to see this project go forward. Hint, data centers, why don't you do this? And then maybe we can refinance you out so that eventually you're just an off taker. But at least you're, with some of the money that they could put in early, that could advance the projects. And if you don't spend that money, when you study why the refurbishment projects are going well in Canada right now, part of the reason is they spent so much time at OPG and Bruce doing the early engineering, doing the studies before they made a final decision, before they said, here's our schedule and final cost, so that they were creating certainty. That takes money. And so that's where, in theory, could the private sector do it on its own? Yeah, but you still have the whole regulatory piece. But yes, you could conceive of that, but then there's still some questions that have to be answered that are solvable. But somebody actually has to want to spend that money early on.
Thank you, Paul. So next question, how can countries with less developed economies and financial systems, specifically in Africa and Latin America, figure out the nuclear energy financing problem, since they would need additional assistance, as even the state financials are weak and private investors would not invest due to the high risk of low or no returns?
Great question. That's why, in part, I talk about the role of government. Like in markets that were just described, government needs to be supportive. And that, again, can take a lot of different forms, but governments need to be supportive for all the reasons that were baked into that question. I think if you can create a solid economic profile, now you start getting into, can that government provide money to get the thing built, and then we can refinance them out in whole or in part, so that that money is not tied up forever in the project? That's one pathway. The other is, looking at partnering with another country and seeing how they can help you with early studies and other types of financing. And again, this gets geopolitically sensitive, and want to sort of stay away from that, other than to say it's geopolitically sensitive and that needs to be considered. But I think that there are ways to go forward, but showing the government commitment, appreciating too, the price of electricity to support financing may not be the price of electricity that your people can afford. So can the government make up that difference? The one other thing that I would say that I find particularly interesting is when you look at the COP process and you look at the G7, country specific solutions that have been put together. Whenever you start talking about the moral debt of the global north to the global south, or the developed world to the others, and you say, hey, guys and girls, write a check. As a US taxpayer, I would say, I would never want my government to write a check and just send money somewhere hoping that something good happens. I would actually use the money to make something good happen. And I think that when you think about all the challenges that, again, were in that question, I think there is an opportunity to open up the conversation to say, this is a way that the global north can deliver projects to the rest of the world where they take on some of these risks. And instead of sending money, they effectively send a project. And then the money is used, the project is there, it benefits the country, it helps lower the carbon footprint. But I think that can be part of this story as well, for the reasons, again, that were in that question, which are very real, because you do have countries that desperately could use nuclear and they can't afford it. And it's not realistic unless something else is done. And so I think that becomes part of the conversation.
And I think adding on that, Festus is asking, so looking at the global financing landscape, is ESG financing gathering momentum to support nuclear energy, and have nuclear energy projects gain the brand image where ESG assets could be considered?
Yeah, I think when you look at green bonds, and I'm actually doing an article on it that's going to come out in a few weeks. So minor plug for that. But when you look at that space, it is encouraging, not just for what's been done, which has not been for new build, but for what is now be eligible to be done. And so I think that is encouraging, not just that green bonds are being offered, but that the market is taking them. And I think that over the last few years, I would say that there's been a dramatic change in nuclear as part of the clean energy solution. I think that, years ago, people could debate and you would think, well, okay, I know the answer and you don't, and vice versa. Well, we see what's happened in recent years, with a lot of unfortunate world events. And we see global temperatures rising and people, it's math, it's basic math. Like you can't get there without nuclear, period, full stop. And I think that there will always be anti-nuclear people you're never going to convince, and there's the people that love it, and then there's everybody else. And I think the everybody else, we're not so much in the rah rah nuclear, let's go, why you should do nuclear. We have to continue that message, of course, and that's really important. But now we got to start delivering projects, and that's what I worry about is we can be rah rah nuclear, and if not enough's happening, we're not actually solving the problems we need to solve, at a national level or internationally. And so that's again where we sit there and say, we got to mobilize capital, and that clean energy story is part of it, but we haven't quite figured that out yet. And I think that is an opportunity where a lot more work can be done, because we're showing that in isolated cases, it already is being done, but now we need to scale it.
It's a really great point. And I think a great question kind of coming out of that is, how is it possible that Elon Musk, for example, can finance space projects, which are very high risk, very large capex, very long-term projects, and we're not able to mobilize private capital to the same scale in nuclear energy? And as a follow-on, is there anything that the nuclear industry could possibly learn from other large capex or critical infrastructure industries that we could then apply to mobilize nuclear energy builds? As you said, is needed. We can't just keep talking about it, but we need to start seeing some movement.
Another great question. I think a couple of things. I think on the Elon Musk point, you always have to be careful when we talk about nuclear. And it goes into the second point as well, is we are a special industry, but let's not get too impressed with ourselves either. You know, and what I mean by that is there are a lot of things we need to work on. And so there's a balance in this. There's a balance of we need new thinking and creative ideas, because to think that we got it right all before is not the correct answer. So even though we've been at this, there's always room for new ideas. However, it is the nuclear industry. You have a nuclear regulator that has a very important role to play. And you don't have a nuclear safety regulator like you have in any other industry. And that is cost, it is time, it is risk, it is uncertainty, and that scares the hell out of people, even though a good nuclear regulator is a confidence building measure. So there's that. You also have the public interest, where if we didn't have nuclear weapons, probably the nuclear industry would be viewed a lot differently. When you actually look at the industry safety record, it's amazing. But people don't know that because we have a few serious events that have been sensationalized and misunderstood. And so, what can we do? A lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of building knowledge so that people really understand the situation. What are the real risks? And as we go into advanced technologies, you hear terms like walk away safe. That matters. As you get into different types of fuel that, as a technical matter, the thing just shuts down. And I'm not an engineer or a physicist, but This is where transferring that knowledge, that education and dialogue becomes very important. But I do think that we do need to think of new ways of doing things. And but what I worry about is just also unrealistic expectations to say, oh, well, Elon Musk did it this way, so we can do it. And we can have a plant in 2 years. Like, no, not so much. So there's a blending of the nuclear culture that makes nuclear unique with let's get new ideas and change the thinking, because it's not your grandmother and grandfather's boring, regulated utility model that's going to get us to where we need to go. And I think what's exciting is, as we, long-winded answer, but when we moved into SMRs and advanced reactors, that created a new buzz. And we're seeing challenges with the sector, of course. But what that dialogue started to do was you're bringing in new sectors into the nuclear sector. When you have Dow teaming up with X Energy, or you have steel and cement companies and mining companies saying, I would love to do nuclear. I'm not going to own it. I'm not going to operate it, but I'd love to get the power because I have to decarbonize, and you're really the only answer I've got. Or how we produce hydrogen to any kind of scale. It's not going to be with wind and solar. Can you do it? Yes. Are you going to run a hydrogen economy by it? No. So like, again, basic math, when you see serious companies looking at nuclear and saying, I need this, that's really exciting. And what's kind of ironic about all this is it was, oh, well, two themes like go back 5 years. Large reactors, oh, we don't need them anymore. Base load power, oh, we're just going to do microgrids. Yeah, not so much, right? What are people talking about now? Oh, yeah, those large reactors, could I have 5 of them, 10 of them, please? And tomorrow, and oh, we need base load power. So you're seeing some of the old stuff come back, which is great too. But we have these new players, data centers mentioned before, that are coming into our industry and saying, yes, please. And that creates new ways to develop projects. I'm involved in a project up in Canada where you see nuclear as an input to produce hydrogen and ammonia. It's not about the nuclear, it's about that end product. And that gets really exciting, and ways to bring in new participants and new money. So there you go.
Yeah.
And I can stay on for a little bit more. I don't have to run.
Oh,
So
thanks, Paul. I really appreciate that. And I think like it kind of makes me laugh a little bit because I remember maybe 10 years ago or so having this discussion with you in terms of why isn't companies like Dow Chemical moving to nuclear? And, I think the social aspects around sustainability and the social costs were also not there at that time. And now we're seeing this drive, and I think companies are looking at these sorts of models.
yeah, one of the unfortunate things in my career was when I was at Bechtel, we were bidding for the UAE project, and we were teamed up with Areva, and our consortium was Areva, GDF Suez, now Engie, EDF, Bechtel, so all like 800-pound gorillas, and Total, which was fascinating because you had an oil and gas major part of our project. And we didn't win, but I think it would have been fascinating to see an oil and gas major come into a nuclear project, because when you look at their balance sheets, you look at their time horizons, nuclear lines up excellently, if that's a word, for their decarbonization needs. And you're seeing some oil and gas majors putting some money into fusion and some advanced reactor technologies. But I think that's a real opportunity too, to decarbonize oil and gas with nuclear, because again, it's not the answer we like, but it's the reality is oil and gas aren't going away. And yet we want to try and decarbonize that as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you. So another question, I think it's a bit of a different angle. So in terms of delivery risk on nuclear projects, what considerations are given to the traditional contractor, subcontractor model in other infrastructure projects versus more vertical delivery structures? And are there particular notes in nuclear which impact what is best in determining the structure for a project?
Yeah, I think from an owner perspective, you want a single point of responsibility. That's always the easiest answer. And so you want and now I'm going to be a lawyer for a little bit, but you want a turnkey project, which is, build it for me, tell me when it's done. Now, as soon as you add the words lump sum into it, that's a type of turnkey contract. You can have a turnkey contract that's not lump sum. And, unless you're a huge state-owned entity, and there's kind of two countries that come to mind, they're kind of the only ones that might do a lump sum turnkey contract. And then, of course, geopolitics come into that. But, the problem that you have as you move away from state-owned entities to the private sector is nobody wants to take on all the risks. And some of those risks are very uncertain when you get into labor availability in a lot of parts of the world today, or commodity prices if they move out of certain historical bands. These are risks that people can't necessarily manage, but they are the true cost of the project. So, what you want to do, I mentioned it before, is really spend the time early on in doing all of your analyses to get those numbers as best as possible. But you want to make sure that the delivery team has experience, and that's really important. But you get into, and maybe this is a seminar for another day, but you see things like alliance contracting or integrated project delivery, and that's had some successes, but the scholarship is very mixed on that. I think the message from alliance and collaborative contracting, or IPD, integrated project delivery, collaborating is important. Getting everybody working together is important. Will they share on profit and loss? Maybe not so much. It depends on the companies, their scopes of work, the relative risk. There's a whole analysis, but I think what the question touches upon is really important, is you do have to think about maybe phasing your contracting between, pre-FID and post. You may think of firming up numbers over time. You may think of segmenting things. So there's lots of things that can be done. Is it a hybrid where some of it is fixed and some of it is floating? There's all kinds of things that become a function of risk appetite. It becomes a function of the capacity of the players you're dealing with. I would say, if I were diligencing things from a financing perspective, the biggest thing I care about is, can you build it? Like at the end of the day, do you have the right team that's actually going to get me a project? If it goes over budget, we can deal with that. If it goes over schedule, we can probably deal with it depending on how much. But can you build it? I think if you've dealt with an experienced regulator, I'm not going to worry, is it going to work? It will work. It's more, can you deliver it? And that gets into execution. And again, when we move into SMRs and advanced reactors and factory construction, that helps to de-risk things, but they haven't done it yet. So we've got to see them do it in reality.
And so speaking of advanced reactors and Gen 4 technologies, we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm around this with early projects already in initial phases. Would you be confident, though, that they can produce the regulatory changes that are required for these projects to meet their projected 30 to 40-month schedules? And so I think this is kind of when you talked about the models in the different intangibles, like the regulatory framework, et cetera. I think it's kind of touching on that angle a bit.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch upon the UAE to make a point. When the UAE started their program, they had one nuclear engineer in the entire country. And but they have large financial resources. So they were able to bring in experts from all over the world to stand up FANR, their regulator. And, FANR had to prove itself, because you can just hire smart people, but if you haven't done anything, you have no track record. And they did it. That's probably not a model that a lot of people can follow for two reasons. One, you probably don't have the money. And two, if everybody tries to go hire those people, there aren't enough of them out there. So, I think what has to happen is, once you pick your technology, you've got to collaborate with whatever regulator that is. You want to still also consider international best practices as well. And when you get into the SMR and advanced reactor front, there are efforts about harmonization. I mean, one of the things we've learned is every plant does not need to be designed differently. You want to standardize as much as possible. And that usually is a conversation about plant design and technology. but it's also a conversation about the regulatory process too. And there's no reason why each regulatory system has to be markedly different. Yeah, there'll be country specific concerns, but as we move into the new technology space, fostering that regulatory cooperation is important for two reasons. One, just again, that theme, create certainty, less unpredictability. But for newcomer countries, if you haven't regulated before, that is a huge project risk. Somebody needs to take it. It's probably the host country, oh, by the way. And so, how you manage that when you may have smart people, but if they're not, there's intelligence and experience. You need both. And it's hard, especially, even for countries, you look at Romania as an example. They have a wonderfully successful operator in nuclear electrica. They have an experienced regulator. That regulator has only ever regulated heavy water technology. So now when they're looking to do an SMR that's a light water design, does that mean they can't do it? No. From a financing perspective, is that a huge risk factor? Yes, because in the financing space, have you done it before? If you have, great. If not, I will use the word first of a kind. People think of first of a kind technology, but there's other first of a kind elements in projects, and all those are risks that need to be dealt with. And so the regulatory cooperation and knowledge sharing and harmonization, all very important.
And I think we'll just take one more question to be cognizant of your time. And thank you so much for staying after. Ed Hu is asking that the Chinese are kind of leading in the nuclear build game. It sounds like a similar command and control framework that you're suggesting. What best practices could we take from the Chinese model domestically and internationally?
I'm going to have to choose my words carefully here, and I apologize in advance. Um, I would say the best lesson learned from the Chinese, well, two, really. One is the national commitment to do it. And you could say, oh, well, they're not a democracy. And I would say, so what? You can still have a national commitment to do it. Look at France in the 70s and 80s, right? France is a democracy. So you have to be careful in analyzing China or criticizing China and dismissing it and saying, oh, well, that's just China. That's sloppy analysis. So I would say the national commitment is very important. Um, I think the other piece of it is it's not only a national commitment, but they thought from the beginning of this wave of reactor build that started in the 2000s about fleet, right? It wasn't we're going to build one. It was we're doing a lot of these. And as soon as you move into the fleet concept, your thinking changes in terms of your supply chain, your human resources, how you design plants at a site because you have more common facilities. There's huge opportunities to create efficiencies and savings once you commit to building a fleet. And so again, you got to this is not a geopolitical discussion. Geopolitics do matter. People can analyze that how they wish. And I think if you dismiss China for geopolitical reasons, that is sloppy analysis. You look at it and say, government commitment, fleet concept, why are they being successful? Those are two reasons, and those don't have to be unique to China or their government system. And I think if you put those on the table from the very beginning, it automatically changes your thinking because it goes back to one of my points from before. It's critical infrastructure. We need electricity. We need it to be clean. And I just need nuclear. And as soon as you get into that frame, that helps drive the policy. Now, China's ability to do certain things may be different than others, but it's that policy commitment to drive the result you want. And that's not unique to the Chinese system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And there are a lot more questions that unfortunately won't be able to get to. But I think that also demonstrates how interesting this topic is and how timely it is, especially ahead of COP29, which we know is going to be a finance-focused COP. So we really appreciate, again, you being here with us today, and to all of our participants, thank you again, and we look forward to future sessions with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope it was helpful. All the best.
Definitely. All the best. Thank you.